I'm Thomas F. Coleman, and I'm a legal director and executive director of Spectrum Institute. I am doing an interview today with Professor David Reichard, who's a professor of legal studies and history at California State University, Monterey Bay. This is part of a larger project that we're doing called Birds of a Feather, which is commemorating the activism by law students and lawyers during the 1970s who were advocating for LGBT rights during that decade. What I'm going to do is ask David to introduce himself, and then we'll begin the conversation.
My name is David Reichard. I'm a professor of history and legal studies at California State University, Monterey Bay. I teach courses in history, legal studies, politics, various different issues. And my research has been focusing recently on the history of early LGBT student organizing in California on college campuses. And I've been exploring this through a number of avenues, mostly looking at comparing, contrasting a bunch of different campuses across California to try to understand what it is that led to their organizing, what impact they had on their campus and community, and what issues they cared about. So working on a book project and various other things.
Okay, well, what you're doing is perfect timing for what we're doing. So maybe we could start with what you discovered about LGBT student organizing on generally on campuses, university campuses. When did it start? How did it emerge? What impact it had on the students and the student bodies, the politics of that era. So maybe you can start with telling us about that.
The sort of movement for students to organize on college campuses started in the United States in the mid-1960s, first at Columbia University, and then it mushroomed out around the country. The very first groups organized primarily undergraduate and graduate students. They sort of focused on trying to create spaces on campus. They were influenced very much by the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and other things that were happening in the mid-1960s, some of the social movements of the period. And they sort of began to decide, well, we want to claim some space for ourselves as LGBT folks. And so the organizing happened in very different ways on different campuses. So there really isn't one story. But I think the best way to think about it is that they began to want to create a public, visible presence on campus that had not existed before. It's not that LGBT students hadn't existed before 1960s, but they organized in very different ways, privately, individual groups, small groups, nothing very public. But beginning in the 60s, they began to sort of want to claim public space. And they did this in various different ways. The most common way was that they formed student organizations on these campuses. And those student organizations became the sort of hub, what I call in my research, organizing home, the organizing home from which they mushroomed out around the campus and doing different programs and other activities. On some campuses, as we probably will talk about in more detail, they had to struggle to be recognized as official student organizations. But once they were recognized, they got all the resources that came with that. And so they could plan programs, they could hold dances, they could do other things to try to educate their peers and the community. So there's a whole group of activities that they would do to kind of build community and educate the campus. The other thing that they did is that they connected very deeply with social movements of the period in various different ways. Some of them were more radical than others and got engaged in more radical politics of the anti-war movement and others of the sort of late 1960s. But as you kind of move into the 1970s, many of the groups became much more focused on creating space and getting involved in the emerging LGBT movement that was becoming a little bit more mainstream, not the sort of revolutionary period of the late 60s, but a little bit more civil rights focused. And so that shift in the sort of mid-1970s changed the way some of them organized on campus. They became much more focused on changing policy, trying to influence legislation, work in community venues to try to shape debates that were happening in communities. And this particularly became very prominent in the late 1970s in the sort of national attack on gay rights that started in Florida and Kansas and other parts of the country, and in California in the late 1970s. And students got involved in all that sort of fighting the backlash against, in California, it was called the Briggs Initiative Proposition 6, which would have prohibited gays and lesbians from teaching in public schools. And students got mobilized by that and sort of got involved in various different sort of political organizing. So the origins, stretch from the mid 1960s, and I always think about it as it changes through the 70s. So it's the late 60s and 1970s that became the period where they really coalesced on college campuses and including law schools.
Was Columbia the first one? What was do you know the first?
Columbia is often credited as being the very first one in 1966. It was called the Student Homophile League. And the Student Homophile League began on that campus, but then quickly, within a year or two, spread to a few other campuses around the region. So Columbia, in addition to Columbia, there was Cornell, NYU, eventually Rutgers, and Penn State. So these schools became the sort of early nucleus. Another early one, which was separate and apart from that East Coast movement, was in Minnesota. That student organization started in 1969. And then most of them in California. There was one early effort at Stanford in the mid-1960s, 67 or so, 67, 68, which didn't last very long. It fizzled out. So most of the organizing in California happened after Stonewall in 1969. So some of the earliest groups were at San Jose State, San Diego State in 1969, and Sacramento State in December of 1969. And then it quickly spread around a lot of campuses in California after that. There's a early few groups in the mid 60s, and then most of them after 1969 nationally too.
Now, in terms of what I would consider unusual places, smaller towns, smaller universities, did something happen in Iowa?
I'm mostly familiar with California, but there was organizing everywhere around the country. So some of the most studied examples are in Kansas, Florida, and New York, of course, California. My work and a few other folks have been looking on California. But it's really almost every place that there was a college campus, students were organizing. The question you raised about rural is very interesting because some of the urban campuses had a really, huge numbers of students that got involved because they were big campuses. And as I argue in my own work, their location in California, close to vibrant LGBT communities, made a huge difference. In Los Angeles and San Francisco, there was a lot of organizing because there was a vibrant community already there. And many of the students, like a lot of college students in Cal State, were commuting. They were not living on campus. So they were already living in those communities. And they just sort of brought that organizing to campus in some of the urban spaces. The more rural campuses sometimes had a little bit more difficulty getting started. And one of the things that I found in my own work is that the students in California, and I haven't seen this really elsewhere, so this I think is a California unique example, they worked together in alliances. They created these alliances, just like the Gay Law Students Association that you were a part of and that others were. But at the undergraduate and graduate level, there were several of those throughout the 1970s where students from a variety of campuses in a region would get together and form they called them coalitions, but they were more like alliances of different campuses. So in Southern California, it's called the Gay Students Coalition. And that Gay Students Coalition, I think, had upward of 15 or 16 campuses, and they would meet for meetings and for social events. But importantly, those small people on smaller campuses could come to those alliance meetings and get some ideas and get some support where they weren't attending school in a big urban space, but they could sort of connect with other queer students in those spaces. So I think the question of rural urban is very interesting because I think it's students were finding each other And they were doing it across different campuses, but they were doing it in very interesting ways.
Tell us what you know about some of the litigation. Like you say that some of the student groups were initially denied recognition or funding or treated differently, and they had to sue in state or federal court. So when did those lawsuits start? What was generally the outcome?
Well, the story is very mixed until 1976. So some of the very first struggles were in California. So Sacramento State is one of the earliest, when they formed what was called the Society for Homosexual Freedom in California at Sac State. The university denied recognition of the president. At that time, the president had the ultimate authority on these campuses to recognize a student organization. That has changed, but that was true at the time. And the president of the campus, and if you look at the private records, it's very interesting, was very fearful of recognizing this group of students because of the publicity that he at the time thought it would be. So the students sued the university through associated students, that's student government. And what's interesting is that the student group, which also included a few faculty members as well, created an alliance with student government, and student government are the ones that initiated the lawsuit. And that lawsuit resulted in a positive decision for the students, First Amendment grounds on association grounds. That became a really important precedent. It wasn't a reported opinion, but it was one where other student groups became aware of it and they used it to their advantage if they faced any struggle on their campus. And in fact, one of the ACLU was very active in trying to help these students out in Southern and Northern California, particularly in Southern California. And when they faced a struggle with a campus president that was saying, no, we're not going to recognize, they would bring out this decision and say, you cannot do this because this Superior Court in California up north has said this is a violation of the Constitution. And it became a tool in the arsenal for students to fight back against the resistance to their organizing on campus. But those lawsuits around the country were very different depending on the place. So for example, Mark Stein has done a great recent study of these important cases that actually reached opinions, that had decisions with opinions. It discovered that by 1976, it took till about 1976 for these courts, for the federal courts to kind of weigh in and say this is a constitutional issue, like Sac State students had discovered in 1971 when that lawsuit was finally recognized. But the struggles really varied from campus to campus. So for example, one very long one in California was in Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. That lasted about 5 years from the time they tried to gain recognition to the time it was resolved. So about roughly 5 years. And those are public university campuses. Private universities, of course, had different issues. They couldn't claim the same constitutional protections because of being a private university. And they struggled as well. There was one relatively long one at University of Southern California, USC, that took a number of years, and the threat of lawsuits and ACLU involvement, it's like a long time to resolve that one.
From what I have been able to determine, prior to 1972, there really weren't any organized law student associations, on law school campuses. Several of them seems to have emerged in 1972, kind of almost simultaneously. Now today, almost all law school campuses have an LGBT student organization. A lot of them are called outlaw groups and so on. Tell us about the emergence of law student organizing in the 1970s.
It's interesting because law students have a somewhat parallel story to what's going on in other parts of the university, except, students in professional school, there's a different sort of agenda, I think, in terms of organizing these, at least from what I can tell. So for example, the organization in Southern California and then one in Northern California were both primarily organized by gay men who were in law school. A number of the feminist women or the feminist student organizations on campus had lesbian student involvement. And so in law schools in particular, well, this was true in undergrad, the difference between women law students and male law students was pretty important. And I think that has a lot to do with the types of issues that the different groups were sort of organizing around. Law students were sort of interested not just in creating social spaces, but in figuring out how to use their skills as lawyers, as emerging lawyers, for the benefit of the movement. That seems to be a thread that runs through a lot of these law student organizing. They would not only organize as a student club, like an undergraduate club would be on a campus, but also try to figure out, well, how do we make this more than a social organization? It was important, of course, for them to gather and learn who were other LGBT folks were on the campus in the law school. But it was equally important to figure out, well, how do we use these skills for the benefit of the community? And that seems to be a thread that runs through a lot of those, everything from the arraignment intervention project that gay law students in Southern California were involved in. I think you were involved in that, in collaboration with the Gay Community Center there. But also in Northern California, sort of thinking about the brief banks that the Hastings students created that they put in the library, so that anyone that was kind of interested in how do I model petitions, what kind of research is out there on these issues, that they would make it public for other lawyers to use. And of course, in feminist organizing, a lot of lesbian students were involved in custody cases and trying to create similar materials for other lawyers who are working on similar cases. So I think part of the motivation for law students was, how do we move the profession in a way that's more friendly to LGBTQ issues, through the course of the 1970s. That's slightly different, I think, than the agenda of sort of undergraduates and grad students in a larger university compared to a law school.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the organizing, I think, is equally motivated by the period, like where social movements of the period are doing similar things, in terms of drawing on the expertise of lawyers to serve the movements. This is happening for law students. I mean, one of the most prominent examples, I think, is the National Lawyers Guild trying to organize their own law schools. Of course, they've been around a while, but gay students organizing in the People's College of Law in Los Angeles is an example there, where they actively recruited LGBT students to apply to the law school to build up that expertise. Students from all over the country would write letters to that group. There's copies of them at One Archives in Los Angeles, where these little cards, and interest cards, they would hand out at events, or people would send little notes to the students that were organizing. It was called the Gay Caucus, and they would get these letters from all these students, potential students, like, I really want to become a lawyer so I can serve the community. And that became a really motivating part of their, how that played out on that particular law school. In other law schools, students were more interested in pushing the profession as a whole, to be more inclusive, whether that's the American Bar Association or any other professional organization, to try to attend to LGBT issues. And so they were really pressing on many sides to try to transform the profession, influence the law itself, serve clients who were underrepresented, and then try to collaborate together with other law students from other places, in a region, to try to create networks that could serve them as professionals, but also serve the community.
One of the things that I noticed, and I'm going to ask you to maybe weigh in some of your thoughts on this, in addition to the gay law student organizing being predominantly organized by males, although there were lesbians, involved in some of them, and it seems to have become more prominent lesbian involvement in the 80s and 90s and so on. But also, it was primarily a white phenomenon that I was only able to identify a handful of law students of color who were out and open as LGBT activists. I could find no lawyers of color during that era who were LGBT activists. So any thoughts about, observations or thoughts about why that was happening, and then later how many more of them have been involved today? You see many on the boards of LGBT, bar associations. There are many lawyers of color that are involved. So what are your thoughts about why it was predominantly white in the 70s and then why it started changing and how?
This is a complicated question, I think, and there's many ways to approach it. On the one hand, I think a place to start is who attended these institutions in the period. And if you look at one of the things from my book I've been trying to uncover is the demographics of these various institutions that I'm studying in California, which is a very diverse state. So you would think this is going to be easy to find. It's surprisingly difficult. These colleges and universities were pretty white in the 1970s. And it's really it begins to change in the 60s and 70s, but it doesn't really change significantly until you get to the 1980s and 90s. So you have primarily white institutions, just to begin with. And then, for example, in law schools, it's predominantly men until the late 70s. I mean, the percentage of women law students is pretty small until you get to the end of the 1970s. So I think the 70s are a period where the shift is starting to happen, but it's not really becoming as prominent as it would become in the 80s and 90s. So it's still a mostly white space. Now, that said, the students of color that were involved in organizing, for example, at the undergraduate level, they often were one or two people of color in that student organizing space. For example, UCLA, the Gay Student Union, which is a prominently gay male space, there were very few men of color who were involved in that. I interviewed several, from my book. And when I asked this question, the question, it was sort of an interesting response. I think one was, well, some of the students of color didn't want to be involved in those white spaces. They didn't feel welcome in those white spaces. And in fact, when you look at some of the internal dynamics, they weren't always attending to issues of race very well, the mostly white organizations. And this is not unusual, I think, for the period, but they didn't always create as welcoming a space for those students. The other thing I think that was going on is that some of those students were much more interested in organizing around communities of color in other areas of their lives. They're very, in a very intersectional way. While they might have been gay, they were also Black or Chicano or some other ethnic identity, and that became much more important at the moment that they were living in. So their organizing shifted in that direction. Like, for example, this is also true for a lot of lesbian students who are involved in these organizations, that they found more common cause with other women and feminist organizations than they did with the gay men in the predominantly gay male spaces. And so even when some of them tried to work in those spaces, again, they didn't feel like the gay men who were there really understood what the issues were that they cared about. And so that they shifted their focus to feminist spaces. And that wasn't a perfect match, because they fought homophobia in some of those spaces as well. But they did find a sort of a greater sense of connection to the issues that women were organizing around. So I think the question is one about context. It's one about taking account for the diversity of issues that people of color are contending with in the 70s beyond their sexuality or sexual orientation or gender identity. And all those things are sort of coming together in their own sense of self and where they want to put their energy.
Also, kind of the same question with respect to open transgender law students and lawyers in the 70s. I could find only one, Phyllis Fry. There may have been others, but they haven't come to my attention. Phyllis seems to be the breakthrough individual that became visible and so on, and kind of created an opening for others that followed in the 80s and 90s. And it's so much more today. And also non-binary, I'm not aware of any open non-binary law students of that era. So maybe part of this is because transgender people weren't as welcome in the gay movement, because the gay movement was trying to tell society a message that we look just like you and a conservative approach. So any thoughts about why there were not more open transgender law students?
Well, I think it's a similar situation that the institutions themselves were not that welcoming. So why would you go to those spaces in the 70s, in particular, when there's no infrastructure? In fact, that's what I think why this generation is so important, student organizers, is that they're creating this new infrastructure that creates a more welcoming space for LGBT folks on campus. But it took a long time, for that to happen. And there were external threats, as I mentioned, Prop 6 in California. So there was a lot of diversion around how do we create these spaces on campus when there's a lot of struggle going on around lots of issues. Now, that said, at least at the undergraduate level, I'm not as familiar with for this at the law student level, but students were interested in these issues. Like if you look at their programming, they would have programs on, transgender wasn't a word that they used in the period. They would have used transsexual, which had a very specific meaning, still does. But they would talk about gender fuck and other kinds of ways to change the way you live in the world. And they would have programs on this, and they would change their patterns of dress or the way they held themselves as gendered beings. And that's as close as I think you can come to our contemporary idea around being transgender. But I think it's really not until the 80s and 90s where this became something that was much more visible.
And I think that I'd like to ask you if you have any thoughts for the current generation of LGBT students, whether undergraduate or law students. Is there any reason for them to study our history? And what can they learn from that era that we're talking about, the 70s or whatever? In particular, now that we're seems like we're beginning to enter an era that somewhat threatening to many rights that were forged in the 70s and 80s and 90s and even more recently. Is there anything they can learn from history, and what message do you have to the current generation?
I think there's a number of reasons I would say this is worth thinking about. The first is this generation was incredibly resourceful and coming together and creating spaces on campus amidst great resistance. And so they had to develop the fortitude to persist, to use a term that is very common today among activists, around Black Lives Matter, to just persist in this struggle, which is a very long-term struggle. They developed the capacity to do this through actually engaging with their communities. So they might have had some setbacks, but many of them kept going. So they persisted in their work, and they kept their eye on the prize. They had a sense of their own role in the wider movement. It's pretty consistent, for example, in the interviews that I did for my project, the work that I've been doing, that they really knew that they were making history, that there was a sense of this is important, what we're doing is important. And part of it was there were so many external threats that they knew that they were pressing some buttons by the work that they were doing. So I think that's a great parallel for today, that if you look at some of the stuff that's going on around the country, it's pretty clear where the lines are right now. And that this is an organizing opportunity for a generation, I think, is that they can use the opposition that's facing a lot of these young queer kids today as a way to mobilize. And they're doing it, from what I've been watching in the media, they're doing that. So that's one thing. The second thing is that none of these student organizers would have done any of this work without allies. They cultivated allies at the institution level, whether it's someone in the Dean of Students office, or it's a faculty member who served as an advisor, or it's a associated student government who supported them. There's a lot of allies that helped these students organize, even on campuses where there was some hostility. So like, for example, I'll use the example of the lawsuits that student government, which are not made up, was not made up of the time of mostly LGBT students. They were mostly probably straight identified students. They became important allies. They would pass resolutions in support of the students. They would file lawsuits. They would do all kinds of things in partnership with the students, the LGBT students themselves, so that they found those allies who could give them the structural support that they needed amidst whatever struggle was going on. And I think that's a really important lesson for today, is that you can't do this alone. You have to find where you have common cause with other students who don't identify as LGBTQ. You know, who in your community also faces this sort of, discrimination or faces hostility, and how can you work together? And of course, today we're much more aware of the sort of intersectional nature of our own identities, that we hold many things at the same time. And particularly for marginalized people from marginalized communities, those intersections really can inform the type of activism that you choose to do. Where race and sexual orientation and gender identity all intersect, there's an opportunity for ally building and for refocusing movements in new ways to focus on those intersectional realities that are much more prominent today than they were in the period in the 1970s. They were there, but they weren't as prominently talked about in the same way. And just the inspiration that this generation can give. I mean, I'll tell you, the more I did the research on this book, the more inspired I became in terms of just their ability to organize. There's a lot of lessons, just basic organizing lessons about how you do this on a campus. So I think at least for college students, I think it would be an important place to start.
Tell us about your book. Do you have a working title? When do you think it'll be published?
So the title, I always have to look because I never remember. The title of the book is Here Are My People, LGBT College Student Organizing in California, 1967 to 1979. And it focuses on this first generation of students that organize publicly on college campuses in California. And I'm focusing on California because most of the research to date has not looked at California. They've looked at other parts of the United States. But California has such a prominent role in the history, LGBTQ history. It's amazing how this has not been really significantly studied. So I'm trying to understand, why those students got involved. The argument that I make is that students made a significant contribution to the development of the movement in the 1970s because they bridged campus and community through their organizing. They brought activists to campus and they moved their activism off campus. They introduced new concepts to the campus community. They challenged established academic thinking, like professors were doing too, but they were challenging ideas about psychology and history and literature where there were no LGBT folks to be found. They were saying, yes, there are. And they were sort of promoting, changes in curriculum policy at the university. They promoted what I call queer creativity. And they, through theater and art and all kinds of other forms of creativity, through poetry readings and film festivals, they were trying to transform the campus into a much more LGBT friendly space where students would feel welcome, because that was really one of the big struggles of the period. So, when they arrived on campus, they thought they were the only ones. And these organizations created that visibility. And it was a theme that has run throughout all the interviews I've done for the project and the documents that I've researched. And of course, their engagement with the movement was very significant, and it took many forms. I'll just give you one example. The students who were, when they would host these gay awareness weeks on campus, this was very common around in the state in the 70s. And almost all the programming engaged questions of the emerging gay and lesbian movement of the 70s. So they would bring activists to campus. They would educate about the political struggles that were going on around the country. They used queer creativity as a way to challenge, heterosexism and assumptions about gender identity that their peers were making. They struggled against homophobia on the campus by reacting to homophobic letters to the editor in student newspapers. So there's just tons of examples of how they brought the movement to campus to try to engage their peers. The book really focuses on that first generation up and through to the end of the 70s.
And when will people be able to purchase the book?
Well, I'm very hopeful. It's under contract with the University of Georgia Press. I'm hopeful that it will come out in 2023. That's the plan. Final stages of its editing right now. So we'll see how that goes.
You want to get it right.
Yes,
So,
academic books take a long time, but
and
it's a long project. I've been working on it for many years.
all that I've seen you've written, and you've written extensively on a variety of topics. You like to do quality work. So I assume, and I think it's a valid assumption, that this book will be a quality book. So thanks for the research you're doing
Thank you.
and sharing it with the general public in the way that you're going to next year when the book is published. Is there anything else that we've missed, or do you think we've covered the territory sufficiently?
We've covered most of what I was thinking of. I think the one thing I would say, maybe to add to this, is that particularly in the legal community, there were lawyers who were not LGBT who supported the community. And I think that's really important to mention, is that even though we've been, the focus of our discussion has been mostly on LGBT folks, there, and to piggyback on my discussion of allies, there were straight allies who supported this community and mentored a whole first generation of LGBT students who went to law school.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I remember meeting Al Gordon, who had two gay sons. One was in law school, and I met him at his son Jerry's apartment when the gay law student group was meeting there. And I was so excited and thrilled because Al was on fire for advocating for gay rights. And he had his background in socialism and communism and anti-war and progressive causes and so on. And he was going to bring all of those skills plus his relatively new legal skills, because he became a lawyer later in life, to this. So he was an example. And, there were lawyers with the ACLU, or they were affiliated with the ACLU, Larry Sperber, and there were Martha Golden, and, just Jill Jakes. So there were any number of lawyers, and I think that's very important to mention. And I think I may even add a little something to the memory book, a special shout out to those lawyers who they stuck their neck out too, because this was not a popular cause.
They did, and they did so in the 1950s and before the 70s. So when a lot of those, I'm thinking of the kind of the cases of gay men being arrested in the 50s for entrapment, being trapped and things like that. Many of them didn't have lawyers, but there were some that tried to put themselves out there with lawyers to try to challenge some of this activity. So I think it's important that they get recognized, particularly in the 70s, for training a generation of lawyers that through their mentoring, maybe not so much in law school, maybe in some cases, but I think it's much more about how they mentored these newly minted lawyers or law students in communities, and they were willing to take the risk, as you say, to represent these clients. I think of even in the sort of lesbian custody cases too. So I think there's a lot of examples of lawyers who saw the injustice with the LGBT community, and even if they didn't share that identity, they were willing to kind of step out for whatever reason, for example, ACLU on civil rights or civil liberties grounds, that this was an issue bigger than this community. And they had the foresight to be able to engage those questions even willing to face the consequences of what that might be.
Okay, well, I think what we're going to do is we're going to end this with a hooray for our allies, make sure that we remember them, and especially since that message is just as important today as it was, back then. So with that, we're going to, end the interview. Thank you, Professor, for your observations, your insights, and all that you're sharing with this particular audience who will view this, those who will read your words in your book when it comes out next year.